Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to give you another round of recent reads. This time I'm focusing on stabby books, which is kind of a catch-all umbrella term that I use for books that fall under the realm of horror, thrillers, true crime, and dark graphic novels. As you can imagine, I have some really good variety here, which hopefully means that I have some recommendations for just about everyone. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's start with an adult horror novel, and I read Apocalypse by Manel Loureiro, and this is set in Spain and follows a man and his cat at the beginning of a virus outbreak. There is some kind of virus that has come out in Russia, and the character begins to hear different whisperings that very strange things are happening. The virus begins to spread to different parts of the world, and he slowly has to make adjustments in his personal life as more restrictions come into place. There is a talk of quarantine, and the story goes from there when soon enough it comes to Spain and he realizes that this virus is actually a zombie pandemic, and the story goes to all the zombie places you would expect it to. So I'll say right off the bat that this book really brought me back to the beginning of the 2020 pandemic with COVID-19 and just all the talk of isolation and quarantine, the news reports, and just finding out how the different governments reacted to it was really realistic and really similar to what actually happened. This book is actually translated from Spanish, and I really do like to see an international book like this, especially with zombie fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction, because so often it is set in a North American perspective. And I think by having it set in Europe, it just gave it more of a global feel, because while most of the action and story really does take place in Spain, I think that Europeans in general are much more aware of global politics, and so it really didn't have that US focus that is so normally common in zombie fiction. And I am someone who does enjoy a good zombie book, and not everyone does. I'll say that this book started out really strong and felt really fresh because of the setup to it, but as we went along, it did feel more like a conventional zombie story, so you do have to enjoy that subgenre in order to enjoy this book. It is a start of a series, and I'm honestly not sure if I'm compelled enough to keep going. Again, I enjoyed it. I find that narrative very comforting, and it really does follow the tropes. So you have characters that are moving around, grouping up with different people, trying to survive. There's some good gory scenes, but it's not over the top. So it was what I wanted at the time, but I didn't finish the book craving more. It didn't leave me going, I need to know what happens next. So for now, I'm going to leave it there. I did listen to it as an audiobook, and I really enjoyed the narration, so do recommend checking it out that way if you can. Next, I want to talk about a middle grade horror novel, and that is Spirit Hunters by Ellen O. This follows a family that moved to a new house that is possibly haunted. The story is primarily told from the daughter's perspective. You find out that she has a bit of a mysterious past. Something happened and she doesn't quite remember it, and it's part of the reason that her family moved away. Now living in this new house, it's a little bit creepy, but the biggest focus is the fact that her younger brother seems to have a new imaginary friend, and this imaginary friend seems to be getting him in trouble. He is just really concerned about doing what he is told, and it sets up a really interesting narrative. I've said so many times that I'm not always a fan of a haunted house story, and so I was a little bit apprehensive picking this one up. But the way it was done worked really well for me. I'll say that it worked because it had much more of a focus on that imaginary friend, which is a trope I really enjoy in horror, where you have a child who has an active imagination. And so it's really a question of, is there something there? Is there a ghost or presence in the house? Or is the boy just simply being a little boy? And I also like the fact that this book brought in a possession element or an exorcism element that I did not expect, but that again is one of my favorite things when I find it in a horror book. And I was also pleasantly surprised to find that this book also incorporates an element of possession, and with that comes an exorcism, and it does incorporate some different traditions, so it's not necessarily Catholic based, but actually brings in different faiths and world religions into the story. And this book has some fantastic representation, as middle grade always tends to do. So the main character is biracial, and that is talked about. She is a partial Korean descent, and you get to hear her talking about different traditions and foods, and I really liked how it was incorporated in a very natural way. I don't read a lot of middle grade, even in the horror genre, and most of the time when I do, I can tell you that I appreciate them, I understand the good points about them, but this one I can honestly say I enjoyed reading as an adult. Reading it myself, I found it to be quite entertaining at times. Not an all-time favorite 5-star read, but it really does hold up as just a good all ages story. Definitely it's completely appropriate for a younger child, and I would read it to my own son as he gets older. But if you are someone who enjoys horror and are interested in trying more middle grade horror, this is definitely one I'd recommend. It's just a solid read, and I definitely plan on continuing on with the series. Next, let's talk true crime, and I read American Predator by Maureen Callahan. This story follows a young woman living in Alaska who is working as a coffee barista, and she is working the night shift, and in the middle of her shift, someone shows up and kidnaps her and steals her away. And so the story follows the police and the FBI as they are trying to track down who has her, what happened to her. And soon enough within the story, it's really not a spoiler because it is right on the front cover of the book, you find out who has taken her, and that person turns out to be a terrible, terrible man who is actually a serial killer. And so within the book, it does open up to a larger story of this man. You get to find out more about his history, and he slowly begins to reveal to the FBI the whole magnitude of his crimes, not just against this young woman, but against his other victims, because you find out that she is not the first person that he has grabbed. I will say that the beginning of this book really grabbed my attention, and I was just obsessed with finding out what happened to this young woman. I found the narrative to be very strong, and it really felt like a piece of fiction, like it read like a thriller, with myself just turning the pages, reading as the FBI were trying to piece it together and get clues. Towards the later part of the book, while it was interesting to learn about this man, and he has done some despicable things, so all the content warnings are in here, but I found the narrative itself a bit more fragmented because the story is told over different interviews, and you kind of get flashbacks to different time periods, and it just didn't hold my attention quite as much despite how dark and disturbing the actual story was. So that's something I often struggle with true crime, and I realize that it is a challenge to make a cohesive narrative out of real events, because again, you're not just writing a fictional story, but really trying to piece together real facts and information into a narrative that makes sense to a reader. So I still would give this book 4 stars. I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys true crime, as well as people that don't read a lot of true crime but are interested in books like I'll Be Gone in the Dark. I think this one is accessible like this because it's not overly long and overly dense. It's actually quite short with a fairly streamlined narrative so that you're not getting overwhelmed by too many details. So I think it's a really good place to start if you're newer to the genre. Now, switching over to thrillers, I also read Outsider by Linda Castillo, which is the 12th book in her Kate Burkholder series. This is a longtime favorite mystery series of mine. It follows a chief of police in a small town that is near an Amish community. The woman's name is Kate Burkholder, as the series name suggests, and you get to follow her in different mysteries as she is trying to solve different crimes. Each book is self-contained, and you really can jump in and out of the series at any point, so no spoilers here for anything in the previous books. But in book 12, we follow an old friend of Kate Burkholder, someone that she actually knew back when she was going through the police academy and they lived together. She has gotten involved in some trouble and is on the run, and basically runs to the small town to get Kate Burkholder's help. And this is basically the story of a corrupt police department, and the narrative is interesting, but it's not a personal favorite of mine. I've never been a big fan of stories, whether it be books or movies, about bad cops. It's not like it offends me, I just don't find it particularly interesting to read about or watch. And so it wasn't my favorite in the series, but it definitely still had some strong points. Now, this book is told over multiple perspectives, including that of the bad cops. And I wish that it actually hadn't done this because I felt like it kind of gave away some of the mystery. Because what the chief of police, Kate Burkholder, is trying to figure out in this case is whether or not her friend is actually a good cop, or if she is lying to her and is actually involved in all the drug dealings and accusations that are being made against her. But because the story is told multiple perspectives, for the most part, you basically know what's going on because you are told a lot more information than our main character has available to her. And that's honestly probably my biggest complaint about Linda Castillo's books, is that so often her books give away too much of the ending. So in a lot of ways, I would describe this one as more of a thriller than a mystery, because again, with a mystery, there has to be more that the reader is left wondering, and we instead actually knew a lot of what was happening. So not my favorite in the series, but honestly, at this point, I'm just in love with the characters. It's my comfort read. I will continue reading the series as long as she keeps putting out books. Finally, let's talk about a horror graphic novel, and that is Volume 5 of The Ice Cream Man by W. Maxwell Prince. And while this is Volume 5, I'm going to keep this totally spoiler free, because what this series is a collection of horror short stories that are told through graphic novel form. So they're all unrelated to all the previous volumes, so you could absolutely start here if you wanted to. I have become a huge fan of this series. As with pretty much any short story, regardless of medium, I enjoyed some more than others, and this was generally a pretty strong collection. The first story is basically making fun of the superhero genre, and so it's kind of a satire, more funny than scary, but I thought it was really funny for anyone like myself that really enjoys the Marvel movies. I also enjoyed a story in the collection that involved a how-to guide on how to be a ghost, and it definitely started out pretty lighthearted and funny, involving instructions how to get a white sheet and cut holes in it and put it on your body and go walking around. But as the story progressed, it actually got much more serious, and actually quite serious to the point of being very emotional. So it had a bit of a gut punch ending, and I really liked it. And I also really enjoyed the last story in the collection, which involves the Ice Cream Man, who is very loosely the main character of all of these short story collections. And he is basically telling bedtime stories to his children, and as you would expect from a horror story, they are terrible. So they're really funny for anyone who has read a lot of children's books. They take those tropes and just twist them in the most hilarious and terrifying and awful ways. So a lot of fun. Overall, I didn't find this collection to be particularly scary, but it was still very entertaining and highly recommend to any horror reader. It's a lot of fun and definitely one you want to check out. So that is it for this video. Of the books I mentioned here, let me know which ones are you most interested in checking out for yourself, and also recommend me one of your favorite true crime books, especially something newer, not necessarily one of the classics, but something that's come out in the last like 3 or 5 years. That would be great to get some new recommendations, because I would like to read more of them. After reading American Predator, I just found myself scrolling through Goodreads looking for more books to read that were similar to it. So I'd love your recommendations, because you know my tastes and you always give me the best book selections. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. I read a lot of stabby books, including horror, thrillers, some true crime, as well as science fiction fantasy. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, hit the notification bell, share it around online, and I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.